going to kick off 5 minutes early. Thank you. I think we're going to kick off 5 minutes early because the room's packed. We can't get anyone else in. A couple of years ago, we had a room like this at this time, and we made John do it twice, back to back, because so many people wanted to see him. We're not allowed to do that today, so lots of your friends and colleagues will be disappointed, but we're delighted to have you all here. So welcome to this Demos event in conversation with Sir John Curtice. My name's Polly Curtice. I'm the CEO of the cross-party think tank Demos. We care about the state and society and how they relate to each other. So we do this event to bring the voice of the public and the views and opinions of the voters out there into conference, so you can be thinking about them as you go about your business. John Curtice needs no introduction. He is the country's leading pollster. He is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, and we are absolutely delighted to be doing this with him. It's the 4th year we've done this, and it's always interesting. The first thing I want to say about it is that we've been at Lib Dems and Labour this year already, and he doesn't hold any punches. And I want to reassure you that he's as tough on every audience and every political party, and that's what we would expect from the honesty and candour and depth of John's experience in this area. So the format is just going to be, John's going to speak for about 20 minutes, half an hour, kind of giving his view of the fate of the party, where the party's at in the polls at the moment. We're going to ask some questions, and then we'll open it up quite quickly to your questions in the audience for a bit of a Q&A afterwards. So with all of that said, I'm going to welcome Sir John.
I normally go wandering when I'm talking, but there's a wire here, which if I go wandering, then we'll have trouble. So this essentially comes in 2 parts. Part 1 is, previous readers catch up, just a little bit about what happened in 2024, trying to make a few points that are relevant to understanding my understanding of the party's current predicament. And then I'm going to focus primarily on why the party finds itself where it finds itself now, as compared with where it was at the time of the last general election. So let's therefore begin with last year. And of course, you won't need me to remind you that with 24% of the vote across Great Britain, this was the lowest share of the vote won by the party since and including 1832. It was a very substantial reverse. Of course, it was a reverse that occurred off the back of a very difficult parliament. I think anybody would admit that the last government was dealt a pretty tough hand by fate and circumstance, not least the COVID pandemic, the Russian-Ukraine war, and the associated supply chain difficulties and the impact of that on energy. None of that was necessarily easy to deal with, but shall we say there were also some own goals, and I certainly take the view, and this will be one of my assumptions as I go on, that apart from arguments about whether or not the last government did or did not increase the size of the state too much and what it did and didn't do about immigration, I think there was also a fundamental question about competence, that basically Partygate and the Liz Truss fiscal event severely damaged this party's reputation simply to be able to provide competent government. Where did the votes go? The votes primarily went to reform. So around 1 in 4 of those people who voted Conservative in 2019 went to reform, about 1 in 8 to Labour, and then a little more than 1 in 12 or so going to Liberal Democrats. So it was already clear last year that Reform were the party that were doing by far and away most damage to you in terms of votes. Of course, they didn't do much damage to you in terms of seats, but frankly, I told this to both Labour and the Democrats, a fundamental foundation of both Labour's landslide majority and the Liberal Democrats' record haul of seats was the success of Reform in taking votes off the Conservatives. The one consequence of that is that the coalition of Leave voters that was the foundation of the Conservative Party's success in 2019. Back in 2019, about 80% of people voted for a party that was consistent with their view on Brexit, which meant that the Conservative Party got about 75% or so of those people who were current supporters of Brexit in 2019. That was fundamental. As you can see, in the wake of the rise of reform, support for the Conservative Party. I mean, most of the people who still believed in being part of the EU, who were willing to vote for Boris Johnson, well, they're frankly pretty difficult. They're probably the last voters you're ever going to lose. And basically you were losing very heavily amongst those who were in favour of being outside the European Union, which does therefore mean, again, although Labour made some marginal progress amongst Leave voters, Labour did not actually make much progress in what was their strategic objective, which was to reconnect in particular with those on the pro-Brexit side of the argument. Beyond that, you need to understand why the electoral system, which of course this party historically has been in favour, did not do you any favours. Number one, and this was basically an historical inevitability, this party was losing over 40% of the vote that it won in 2019. Its vote simply went down more heavily in places where it was previously strongest. And because you were losing so much of your former vote, that was arithmetic almost difficult. There were about 80 constituencies where you didn't have 20% of the vote to lose, because you didn't have 20% back in 2019. By the way, I'll show you in a moment how this is relevant to where we're at the moment. The second thing which is also true is that, frankly, the one message, the one consistent message that the electorate seemed to want to convey last year was get them out. And that, therefore, people who switched to reform when polling was done, for example, by Public First, saying, well, if you thought that as a result of voting for reform you're going to let Labour in, they didn't care. They wanted to punish you. They didn't care what the consequences were. And meanwhile, amongst the remainder of the folk who were keen on getting you out, essentially, as you can see here, the Labour vote goes up in places where they were starting off in second place, but it wasn't really going up much elsewhere, apart from in Scotland. And the Democrats were going up basically in places where they were starting second and hardly at all anywhere else. In other words, voters were willing to vote tactically for whichever of Labour or the Democrats, and in one or two instances the Greens, were best able to defeat the Conservatives. And those two things explain why, in the end, if you'd simply lost 20% of the vote everywhere, you would have still had twice as many seats as you actually got. Those two movements cost you another 100 seats or so. That's why they end up looking so bad. What was also true, and again, I think it's important to understand our current political circumstance, it started before Brexit, but one of the things that Brexit did was that it killed the traditional relationship between social class and vote. This is historically the party of the middle class. But because the supporters of Brexit are disproportionately amongst those people who have less in the way of educational qualifications, that's not a judgment, it's a statement of fact, and therefore they're more likely to be in working class occupations. Basically, the relationship between class and vote for both Conservative and Labour disappeared in 2019, and it was not restored in 2024. Labour did not particularly reconnect with working class voters. Yes, the party that was disproportionately more popular amongst working class voters was Reform. But it does therefore mean that both you and Labour have lost your fundamental demographic anchor that used to be the demographic foundation of the traditional two-party system. Equally also, one of the other things that was happening in the wake of Brexit, although it's not just to do with Brexit, is that our politics are no longer unidimensional. It's no longer simply a battle between left and right, between those who think that the role of government is to reduce inequality versus those who say, no, the role of government is to provide the incentives and the circumstances for economic growth from which everybody will profit. That's the classic left-right argument. Now, it is true, I'm using data which I won't go into the detail of here, but here you can see you're much more popular amongst people on the right, and Labour are much more popular amongst people on the left. But notice that when it comes to being able to define who votes for reform, What defines them is not so much whether they're economically left or economically right. It's whether you are a social conservative or a social liberal. It's whether you are somebody who is happy living in a diverse society or not. Somebody who thinks that you should be apologising for Britain's imperial past or not. It's all those socially conservative themes that Reform emphasise. And that is above all what defines them. And of course the Greens are very, very much at the other end of the spectrum. But it does therefore mean that our politics, because there are people who are on the left who are socially conservative, e.g. the current Home Secretary. There are people on the right who are socially liberal. The point is, these things are not necessarily, they don't go together. And that therefore, there are 4 value spaces. And that makes it difficult to maintain a two-party system as well. Finally, and by no means least, and again, this is a theme that I'm going to be going back to understand what's happened. The truth is that we are talking about a deeply pessimistic electorate, which has lost a great deal of confidence in the ability of our traditional mechanisms of government to deliver. This is a question that goes all the way back to the Kilbrandy Commission, for those of you who remember that. And it basically asks people, do you think the system of governing Britain doesn't need much improvement? That's the blue line. Or it needs a great deal or quite a lot of improvement. And you can see that while the advent of New Labour and the constitutional reforms of that era seem to improve people's perceptions of how we're being governed, since then, gradually, just put a straight line through that lot, we've been getting more and more doubtful about how a system of government is operating. And what you discover, if you then break this down, or break each party's support according to their view on this question, well, you've got a mixture of the discontent and the not so discontent, but you were split 50-50. Labour were getting the contents, the Democrats were getting the contents. The 2 challenger parties, the 2 new challengers to the system, the Greens and above all Reform, were getting the support of people who say, this country does not work. And that's a fundamental thing that one needs to understand. So that's the backdrop, and I'm going to be picking up some of these points and how they help us to understand what has happened during the course of the last 15 months. This is, first of all, what the opinion polls have been saying on average. Is basically a running monthly average. And as you can see, you made a little bit of recovery in the immediate wake of the general election, but since then it's been downhill. There's a particularly sharp drop here and a particularly sharp rise to Reform here. That's in the immediate wake of the English local elections on the 1st of May, when Reform did particularly well. You are running at 17% at the moment. You've been at 17 to 18% basically since the spring. And I think by however you calculate it, this party is now at its lowest degree of popularity in the history of modern opinion polling. It was almost this low in the spring of 2019, and then along came Boris Johnson. But obviously one question we can ask ourselves, where is the Boris Johnson Mark II that might be able to turn things around? What you also need to understand, and it's not just a problem for you, it's also a problem for Labour. You may be asking yourself, well, how is it that we're only going to get 45 seats according to one of these so-called MRP polls, even though we're still ahead of the Democrats in terms of votes? Well, point one, because of what I showed you earlier, where the party is losing votes more heavily in places where you were previously strongest, and conversely, the Liberal Democrats did best where they were previously strongest, the Liberal Democrat vote is now much more geographically concentrated than your vote. And the electoral system is now treating you like it used to treat the Liberal Democrats, all right? And so if the Liberal Democrats are just behind you in votes, they are going to almost undoubtedly win more seats than you. But as you can also see here, that your support, it's down on average by 7 across the country as a whole, but it's down by 9 in the places where you're trying to defend. Down by 10 in the places that you lost to the Tories. Oh, by the way, parenthetically, Labour have the same problem. Labour are losing 40% of their 2024 vote. Their vote's going down more heavily in places where they're previously strongest. Put those things together, Reform with a geographically evenly spread vote but coming first will indeed go walkies under our current electoral system. And more in common, basically the data is very, very similar. So that's why these MRP polls are suggesting that with just 31% of the vote, Nigel Farage might be able to get an overall majority. So, start picking up some of the themes already introduced. So where are Reform getting their support from now? Well, the Labour Party are spending a great deal of time attacking Reform, but boy oh boy, they're still doing far more damage to you. Indeed, if we actually look just at where have all the 2024 Tories gone to Reform, nearly every one of them. Right, you are hemorrhaging support to Reform. So hardly anybody's gone to Labour or the Liberal Democrats or the Greens. Yes, Reform are also picking up some support from Labour, and they weren't in 2024, and also the Liberal Democrats. But they are still essentially primarily gaining ground by winning support of you. And by the way, as you might now have guessed, it is the Brexiteers that they are getting. I'm now breaking down 2024 Conservative voters according to those who are in favour of being inside the EU and those who are outside. These are the folk who want to be inside. You're finding it more difficult to keep the folk who are anti-EU. And where are they going? They're going to Reform. Reform are not picking up Remainers. That's insofar as Labour and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens are able to pick up anybody, then they're picking up what's left of your relatively small pro-EU vote. And as a result of that, and this is a pretty remarkable change in 5 years. Just notice that you are now barely any more popular amongst those people who voted for Brexit than those who did not. And so the crucial thing you have to understand, and it's really, really difficult, the Johnsonian coalition of 2019 has been whipped from underneath your feet by Reform. And so that realignment of British politics that occurred in 2019 has been, it's still there. I don't think that Brexit doesn't matter in our politics. It's still fundamental. But your problem now is that basically you do not now occupy either the pro-EU or the anti-EU space. So let's then look a little bit more about how the public look at the Conservative Party and how this might help us to understand a bit more. Now, this is kind of fairly, it's fairly banal, but I'm putting it up for one reason. So this is simply YouGov, who basically pretty much every week, every month, ask people, do you think favourably or unfavourably of the Conservative Party? These are the net favourability figures, and as you can see, basically, you are in minus territory, around about minus 40. There was some improvement in the immediate wake of that disastrous election result, but I will simply note that basically there has not been any improvement since the autumn of last year. And you all know in this room what happened in the autumn of last year. Perhaps also important to note, given what I've said about the lack of confidence in the ability of our traditional governing instruments to be able to govern this country, and also because, as I said earlier, my understanding of why this party did so badly is its reputation for competence was destroyed in the last parliament, is to look at voters' perceptions of whether or not this is or isn't a competent party now. Now, this is the perception amongst all voters. Now, unsurprisingly, amongst all voters, lots of people don't think, you could run a whelk stall, but they probably thought that years ago. This is the view of the people who voted for you in 2019. And as you can see, there had been some improvement by the autumn of last year, but at the moment, you are barely more likely to be regarded as competent than incompetent amongst those people who voted for you in 2019. And indeed, if we dig a little bit further and compare the net favourability scores that I've just shown you with the equivalent net favourability score, competence scores for Reform amongst 2019 Conservative voters, you will see that in the most recent reading, which came out last month, Reform are more likely to be regarded as competent by 2019 Conservative voters than the Conservative Party is. There was even Stevens in the spring, and even that's fairly remarkable. But you are therefore haven't had much success in persuading people you can govern this country, and above all, you've not had much success in persuading the people who voted for you back in 2019. Some of whom, of course, left by July of last year, but many also had not. And again, more broadly, to emphasise how this lack of confidence is crucial. It's crucial to your problem. It's also crucial to Labour's problem. These are the views of Reform supporters on the ability of Kemi Badenoch, Blue Line, and Keir Starmer to be able to solve the questions of the economy, health and immigration, which are clearly the three big policy challenges facing the UK at the moment. Now, in a sense, this doesn't really give you the big head. I mean, surprise, surprise, Reform voters really don't think Keir Starmer can solve these issues, but they're also negative about you knowing that. You may be saying, well, so what? Well, the so what is, as the next slide shows you, is that Reform supporters have less confidence in your ability to address these issues than Labour supporters have in your ability to address these issues. They really are the folk who don't think you can do things, but equally it's true, right, that Reform supporters' view of the Labour Party on these issues is also more critical than the view of your supporters on Labour, right? So again, you can see the extent to which this question of lack of confidence, perceived lack of competence, becomes crucial. Now, as a result of this, there then really is something that I have not seen before happen to an opposition party. But it is quite striking, and that's, in a sense, the last point I'm going to make. So the first thing to say is that, unsurprisingly, the people who voted for you in 2024 think that the country, in a sense, is going to the dogs, right? So 42% of them think that the economy is getting a lot worse. 59% of them think that immigration's getting a lot higher, and 29% of them think that the health service is getting a lot worse. Hardly anybody thinks, by the way, that any of these things are getting better or that immigration is getting lower. So you've got a group of people out there who are pretty unhappy, and you would normally expect to be able to hang on to them. We've got an unpopular government, probably not making much progress on these things. This should be meat and drink to an opposition party. The trouble is, you're getting the blame by your ex-supporters. So this is slightly more complicated, so let me just walk this through a little more slowly. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the folk they're taking the views of 2024 Conservative voters on immigration, okay? And these are the folk who voted Conservative in 2024 who think that immigration is now a lot higher. These are the folk who think it's a little higher, and these are the folk who think it's staying the same, okay? The bars tell you what proportion of 2024 Conservative voters who have these views, who are willing to say they would vote Conservative again. And what you have to notice is that the folk who think that immigration is a lot higher are less likely to vote for you. They think the country's going to the dogs. You are finding it above all difficult to hang on to the people who think the country's going to the dogs on this issue. Where they're going, and you've got it, they're going to reform. But it's not just immigration. The same is true of the state of the economy. 2024 Conservative voters who think the economy is getting a lot worse are less willing to vote for you again than those who think it's the same and the better. So I think it's a combination of the general lack of confidence, together with that probably you are still struggling to escape the blame for what happened between 2019 and 2024. I know many in your room will think it's unfair, but that's the reality. You are still clearly struggling to escape the blame for the current condition of Britain. But it's remarkable that an opposition party should actually be losing votes against those circumstances. And even on the health service, you're slightly less likely to gain support amongst people who think that the health service is getting a lot worse. But you might think, that's clearly an issue to do with the government. Finally, obviously, I have to say all these things about all the leaders of all the parties. This is how Kemi Badenoch has emerged so far in terms of getting YouGov's net favourability measure. And basically there are two messages. Message number one is that there is gradual improvement, which is the top line, in terms of the percentage of people who say they don't know when they're being asked by the pollsters to say whether you think favourably or unfavourably about her. So that's the good news. The bad news is that her net rating hasn't improved in consequence. In other words, as people get to know her better, they're not necessarily getting to like her more. So that's the downside. Now, so that obviously I think then leaves one obvious final question, which is, so how does this party deal with this? There is no doubt that it's difficult. But here is one thought. Sometimes when you're facing a battle, you might decide to try and go straight for the front line of your opponents. But of course, in going for the front line of your opponents, you're going to be going where they are best reinforced. An alternative tactical battle, depending on the geography, etc., may be to think about going around the flanks at the side, which are perhaps not quite so well defended. And given that you are losing ground not just on immigration, but on the economy and on health, but that at least on the economy, there is still a modicum of trust in you amongst 2024 Conservative voters. This is the issue on which, as it were, they look as though they might be more likely to be won back. This is the side flank. Reform and Farage is much less likely to be trusted on the economy than he is by immigration. So the question I would pose to you is, does it necessarily make sense to try to out-reform reform as opposed to try and go around onto issues which are different? Now, of course, that does still raise a substantial challenge, because what is the answer that this party has on the economy that is better than that of the current government, and also will be sufficiently convincing that will begin to address at least some of the concern that Reform voters clearly have, not just about immigration in particular, but about the state of the country in general. Don't pretend that's easy, but it seems to me that that might be a place to start, rather than simply, because certainly one of the things that I and other pollsters have noticed, that basically so far, who's done best out of the conference season, which has been dominated by Reform, the answer is Reform. Reform support's been going up. They've almost been had well, it depends on what you guys decide to do for the rest of this week. But at the moment, it looks as though Reform have not had one party conference, they've had 4, and they're probably thanking their opponents for giving them so much free publicity time. Anyway, those are my. I mean, essentially, there are 3 points. 3 points which you can't do much about. You've lost the Johnsonian coalition. You need to understand that as to know where to go from here. You are struggling to regain your reputation for competence, and you're lagging behind Reform on this. And as a result, you are actually being blamed still. You're still losing ground on those people who think that the central challenges facing this country are not being met. But maybe the way back is around the side and not trying to go through the front door.
your faces, which was quite the sight. Thank you, Sir John, and thank you for sticking with those really, really tough messages. Thank you for finding a bit of hope in there as well, a strategy that
well,
people...
you know, they wouldn't come again next year, would they? If we didn't
I mean, that image of reform having had 4 party conferences, not one, having been at my 4th party conference now, feels
got a sense of
very
deja vu,
true.
have you?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, especially listening to the leader's speech earlier. That focus on the economy, when I was going around and talking to the audience before, everyone had a version of the question, kind of what's the strategy through this? Focus on the economy. Which voters should the Conservative Party be focusing on now?
Well, I mean, clearly the first way back for any political party is to try to win back some of the people who used to vote for you, which is why I focused on that group. I mean, in general, I'm extremely sceptical about strategies about Worcester Woman or Mondeo Man or et cetera. At the end of the day, you need to understand that, you know, this party has just lost an enormous amount of support. It needs to gain ground broadly across our society, but the starting place has to be the people who at least were willing to vote for it last year. I mean, because it's always easier to win back people who voted for you before than to try to win over people who have never voted for you. So that just has to be where you start.
One of the things we've talked about a lot in these sessions is the kind of overall issue of trust in democracy, trust in politics overall, which all the parties, perhaps apart from Reform, are suffering from in one way or the other. How does that affect particularly the Conservative Party?
Well, I think, as I was suggesting what I did in the talk, is that, I mean, it is true. I showed you the data on governing, but it's also true if you look at the data on trust in governments, particularly with the question on BSA, which asks people whether you trust politicians to put the interests of the country first above those of the nation. And again, the trend is very similar. You know, again, I mean, particularly, I think I showed you there on governance, the two parties were fairly, the Conservatives were getting kind of drawing equally from the two wellsprings. I mean, unsurprisingly, given you were the party of government, you were more likely to do well amongst the people who were trusting the people who were not trusting. But again, the point is the Reform voters are also the ones who don't trust. That's where they're going. So it's just part of that broader impression that, you know, we are talking about I mean, one of the things that emerged out of 2024, you know, it was an election in which the electorate definitely wanted to turf this party out. It didn't really embrace Labour. Labour support wasn't very firmly embedded within the electorate. And some of us were looking at this going, well, what's this going to happen if this government isn't very successful? Well, you can see what's happened. But the point is that, in a sense, I guess in a sense, the challenge to this party is that the role of oppositions is meant to be to provide an alternative government. And I think one of the things that is feeding Reform is that the public don't think there is an alternative, at least within our conventional politics, to the current incumbent government. And so it's that. So I mean, essentially, Reform are a combination of two things. So in part, absolutely central is their socially conservative message. That is the thing that pulls people towards them. Okay, but what's pushing people away and making them available is the fact that we've not been able to grow the economy since the financial crash. The fact that the health service has got these enormous waiting lists. The fact that, you know, we can argue about what levels of immigration should be, but the fundamental problem is that ever since 2005, there hasn't been a clear relationship between the rhetoric on immigration and the reality on immigration. Okay, so these are, and of course, we're then trying to deal with all these issues against a very severe fiscal constraint. which is partly a product of the weak economic growth. It's in those circumstances that the public are deeply pessimistic, so reform voters aren't just concerned about immigration. People who go to reform are also people who think the economy is doing badly. They also think the health service is doing badly. But the point is they then go to reform if they're also of a socially conservative bent and they're concerned about immigration. Whereas if they're less socially conservative bent, then at the moment Labour are losing their folk to the Liberal Democrats and to the Greens, and you at the last election were losing them to Labour and the Liberal Democrats.
Another line that really struck me, that this is the worst drop in popularity in the history of modern polling.
Well, the Conservatives' current share is their lowest, yes. And it's occurred at the same time that a newly elected government has suffered the worst ever drop so early in its lifetime as a government. So again, this is what is remarkable about all of this. I mean, again, just be aware that in combination, Conservative and Labour have the support of less than 2 in 5 of those people who have a vote intention. It's never been that low before. We are in completely unprecedented territory.
Can you think of the second worst that managed to turn it around?
Well, the last time we had as big a challenge to the conventional party system was back in 1981, 1982. But actually, now, and in terms of share of the vote, that was the more substantial challenge because you were then talking about only 3 significant parties. So, the alliance, as it then was, had to be well up into the 40s in order to be clearly ahead of both the Conservatives and Labour. But it's already the case that by having been ahead in the opinion polls now for 6-7 months, Reform have now been ahead in the polls for longer than the SDP Liberal Alliance ever were. And of course, and at the end of the day, I mean, the point is that, for this party, reform is the challenge. But the point is that actually more broadly, the challenge is also coming from the Greens. That's what Labour have to worry about, as well as the Liberal Democrats still being significant players. So we've got this fractured 5-party system, which means that the share of the vote you need to be able to come first is much lower. But it is still the biggest challenge that our conventional party politics has faced.
I'm going to come to the audience for questions after this question.
This is the difficult one, is it?
No, let's not build it up too much. What have the Conservatives got to lose at the moment? How bold should they be in their offer to the country?
Oh, the Conservative Party potentially loses its role as a significant governing party in the UK. I think it is that serious. One possible. There's no great secret here. Nigel Farage, in a political thinking podcast with Nick Robinson, said some weeks, months before the 2024 election that he would not re-enter British politics unless he thought there was a chance that Reform could replace the Conservative Party as the principal centre-right party in the UK. 2 weeks into the general election, I think probably having seen that in contrast to 2019, the Conservative Party was not succeeding in squeezing the Reform vote, he enters. And the rest is history. And of course, the other thing now, those of us who watch these things from a distance, the other crucial development now is the extent to which Reform can actually create a party organisation of activists up and down the country. That's the objective. The fundamental weakness of the Eurosceptic movement hitherto has been a failure to develop a stable party organisation. That's what Reform are trying to do. But look, let's call a spade a spade. It's already got 1 MP. It's got a number of ex-MPs, of 1 or 2 members of devolution bodies who have gone. And I've heard one analysis of the local elections that said that more than half of the people who are elected as Reform councillors in May are former members of the Conservative Party. They are not just taking voters, they're beginning to take senior folk, they're taking activists, and they're probably taking money too. And that's why it probably needs to be turned around to a degree at least sooner rather than later, because the risk you undoubtedly face is that if this carries on for another 2 years or so, the money and the ambitious will follow the polls.
Brilliant. So questions. I'm going to go to Peter in the pink shirt there, and then the lady behind you just there after Peter's asked his question.
Hi John, just a quick question. I was at the Lib Dem conference a couple of weeks ago, which I think you were...
I was there too, yes.
And speaking privately to them, they seem to be working on the assumption that the 60 seats they won for the Conservatives last time are basically theirs now. They don't seem to be thinking there's any chance of the Conservatives winning them back. And I know at that conference you kind of warned that what they can gain in terms of future Tory seats is potentially slightly limited.
Yeah.
But in terms of the seats they've won, do you see any signs of anything the Conservative Party is doing to get them back? And if that isn't the case, is there a route to power for the Conservatives without all those seats in, so-called blue wall seats?
You won't get them back until you get your national vote share up, right? I mean, it's basic, right? I mean, at this stage, don't worry about constituencies, worry about voters. You just need an awful lot more supporters. Because, of course, at the moment, the Liberal Democrats can hang on to what they've got because you're not going to pose any challenge. Now, if in contrast, you were even back up, let's not be too ambitious here. Let's get you back up to, let's say, 30% in the opinion polls. And at that point, you'll start to be effective. And if the Democrats don't make any significant advance, and they haven't made much of an advance so far in terms of their national vote total, and given, for example, that probably the animus against this party by 2029 will be weaker than the animus that was there in 2024, and fewer people will be inclined to vote tactically against you, sure, you can start picking up. Oh, no, of course, the Democrats, they will attempt to dig themselves in where they're at the moment. Then they would probably need to try to be able to come up with an economic message that says, yeah, this is how we're going to make life better for today's younger generations, and I don't see it at the moment.
Brilliant. I want to say thank you for some brilliant questions from the audience. Thank you for coming today, and thank you to Sir John for sharing such rich insights that I know will be really important for this conference to go forward with. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening so patiently, and thank you to Demos for organising all this. And enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you.